All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about using CSS classes in order to style individual elements. So this is going to add a little bit of new syntax to our CSS. We're going to begin adding new selector syntax. Particularly we're adding this new idea of what's called new CSS selector. We're also going to talk a little bit about some coding style some coding style sort of ideas that come along with sort of ideas of how we work with classes. Okay, so again, what we're going to talk about is we'll talk about the CSS class selector. We'll introduce the concept of the cascade and talk a little bit about specificity. We'll talk about that in more detail later, but we're going to sort of introduce the concept now. And then we'll talk a bit about how to choose class names and how we sort of deal with those kinds of ideas. Okay, so the idea of what we've done so far in CSS is we've talked about how we can style elements based on their element. So what I've done is if I have a list of items, I can, for example, add some styling to my LI elements by selecting every single LI element on the page and adding some kind of styling for it, right? I can give it a font family of Helvetica, for example, right? If I want to make it be in a sans serif font, I can be able to do that kind of thing applying to that element. But the question is, how can we apply an element has styling to a particular single element and not to all of them at once, right? How can I choose a single LI element and style just that one list item and not have to style all the rest of them at the same time? And so the way that the easiest, most common way we're going to do that is by using what are called CSS classes, or using what's called the class selector. So what this is going to let us do is we're going to let us be able to annotate a particular HTML element with what's called a class attribute. So it's going to be class like classification, right? You think of it as almost like saying what kind of element this is. So we might say this is what kind of paragraph is this element? Well, this paragraph is a highlighted element, for example. So we can add a class attribute to that element in order to sort of give it an additional labeling. So not just that it's a paragraph, but here's what kind of paragraph it happens to be. We can add CSS class attributes to any HTML element. So you can pick any single element on the page and give it a class. You wouldn't do this to the head or anything, and you can't, but you can do it to the body, though that's not very common. But really, any HTML element on the page, we can do that. So, for example, if we go back to our example here, I could, for example, say I want to style this last line because it does not rhyme, right? Or it is out of place. So I can write down a name of a class for this. The name of the class that the name that you give to the class is up to you. We'll talk more about how we come up with class names later in the video, but it really can be anything you want. We're going to write class names. You can't put spaces in them, right? Because spaces are used to define multiple things. So you have to sort of write them all out as one phrase. If you want to have multiple words, generally we'll put hyphens between them. So this might be the out of place class. More commonly, you'll find sort of single word explanations for things. So this might be like a highlighted class. What we can then do in our CSS is we can write a selector that will say, let's apply the styling rule to only elements that have that class, that are of that classification. So not elements of that tag, but elements with that class. So the way that we do this is we're going to write the name of the class that we want to style. So in our example here is highlighted. In our example with our out of place, we might say that I want to style the thing that's out of place. Right, that's our rule. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put a period, a single dot in front of that name. The dot means element with class of, right? It's all that whole phrase, element with class of, is compressed down to just a single tiny dot. CSS uses a lot of tiny little punctuation marks to have very, very big meanings. So what we would do is we would write this as dot out of place. Note that there's not a space between the dot. It is just literally, I'm just writing the name of the class with dot. So it's dot out of place. And that's sort of how we would write the name of the class, right? Dot out of place, dot highlighted. If we mouse over this in VS Code, we can then see which elements it's going to select to. And I can't point with the mouse. So for example, this is now going to select, this rule will now apply to any elements, whatever element that is, right? It could be a list item, it could be a paragraph, doesn't matter what it is, but that has the class out of place. And it would look like class equals out of place. So for example, I can flag that this is out of place. We can give it a background color of yellow to well, maybe not yellow. How about let's do like maybe a green or a green yellow, or make it kind of a greenish thing to highlight it because it's out of place. Right. So when I do that, if I then refresh my page, right, now that list item has now been styled, right? We've added styling that applies to just that particular list item. And that's how we then add classes to style individual elements. If we want to say, I want to style just this paragraph, I want to style just this list item, just this H1, just this whatever, we can add a class to that element, right? So we're going to go to that HTML and give it a class attribute that has some name for something. And then we'll simply write our CSS to say, select elements with a class of that name. And that's the thing that we want to then be able to see. Okay. Now, it's really important that you remember the dot when you're writing the CSS selector, right? The dot is indicating the way it's the name of that we're saying that we're referring to a class, not to an element. If I don't put the dot here, right? If I just say style things that are out of place, if I hover this in VS Code, you can see what it's trying to style. It's trying to style an element that has a type out of place, right? It's looking for me to have written somewhere in my HTML out of place with some content. Like it's hoping, and that's what it's trying to style. Now, out of place isn't a valid HTML element. There is no such thing, so we can't do that. So what we need to do is we need to remember that if I'm referring to a class selector, if I want to say styling a particular class, we have to remember to include that dot. And I know it's just a single dot, and it's often easy to miss, but that's the thing we need to remember to include. Similarly, to be clear, the dot is used in our CSS selector to say things with class of out of place, right? This means elements with class of out of place. The dot isn't actually included in the name of the class, right? When we wrote our HTML, my class was just out of place. I didn't put the dot in here. I didn't say my class was dot out of place. That would actually be an invalid class name because you can't use dots at the start of your class name. Your class names have to start with letters or symbols, but letters basically is what we have to deal with. So again, the dot is used in the CSS to say select is used in CSS selectors, things we with, but the name of the class is just a word. And it's, again, it's a name that we are allowed to come up with. You can name it whatever you want. There's no restrictions here. It's really like come up with your favorite label, label it and tag it however you want. Okay. To be clear, when we say that an element, right, a CSS rule styles any element with class out of place, that literally means any element on my page that has the class out of place. That can be elements of different types, right? So for example, if I had a rule to style elements with class green, right? So it would, in our CSS, it would look, I don't know on the slide, but it would look like dot green, right? Style elements with class green. Then we could apply that to a paragraph, in which case this paragraph would be green, right? It would have that class. It would look like it wants. But we could also apply the exact same rule, right? The exact same property to an LI element, right? This LI element also has a class of green, which means this element will also be green as text. In our sort of live example here, we can actually, for example, we decided this paragraph was out of place. We could give it the out of place example. And now that paragraph is also getting highlighted as being out of place. So CSS classes are really intended and they can work with any kind of element. You often want to think about them how much you want to annotate or describe something. So green is one example where I want to style some things green. Highlighted is a very common example, right? I want to be able to say this element is highlighted and that element might be highlighted too. It might be of different types. We can sort of mix and match these things as you go. It's not super, I mean, it's not, you don't do it a lot. It depends a little bit on how you sort of go about approaching your CSS. And I'll talk about this more in the end of the lecture, the video. But often you'll want to sort of be designing your CSS where it kind of applies to sort of certain kinds of elements. Like it's not going to apply to other things. Like we're not going to style list items the same way we'd style paragraphs just because they're different kinds of things. But the class will select any element with that type. The selector will apply to any element with that class. All right. To be clear, an HTML element can have multiple classes. And this is actually really common. HTML elements often will have multiple 2, 3, 6, 12 dozens of different classes, and that's not unheard of. Classes are listed in the exact same class attribute, right? So a paragraph or an element only ever has one class attribute. You don't put multiple copies of that attribute in there. You just say one class element. These are the classes that I have. And you don't write classes, it's always class. And then what you're going to do is just like HTML attributes got separated with a space, we're going to separate our class names with a space. So for example, this paragraph has 3 classes. It has a first class, right? Something called labeled first class. something labeled second class, and something labeled third class. You can see the spaces in between here, which are distinguishing, which are sort of separating out what things are different classes. So in this case, I would style this paragraph with elements that, so rules of a style of this paragraph might be, right, first class would style it because this element does have the class first class. It has other classes as well, right? It has other tags, right? Other labels on it, but we're not talking about we're not asking for all the labels at once. We're saying, what does it have this particular class at all, right? So this says has this class, right? Can have others as well. That's how server CSS is going to work. As a more common example, what you might see in, I've used this actually in like the Canvas page directly, right, is I can have a paragraph that has the class alert. It is an alert type class, but it also is a warning type paragraph, and that's going to then give it a, like, make it show up as an alert, so it's going to be boxed down a certain way, and because it's a warning, it shows up as being like orange or yellow, sort of, again, making a warning dialog. So again, this is an element that has the alert class and the warning class, and you can tell because there is a space between them. Don't try to use a comma. In some languages, we'll use comma to separate things. These are just spaces, or how we separate things in HTML. Okay. So sort of now that we've got classes that are able to apply to multiple elements, right? I've got this paragraph that's got multiple classes. It's both an alert and a warning. I want to talk a minute about sort of what we mean by the cascade. So CSS, you may recall, stands for cascading style sheets. What is the cascade? Well, the idea with the cascade, when we talk about the cascade, is that multiple rules that we write, right, multiple CSS rules, can all apply to the same element at the same time. This is a cascade of styling. And so when we talk about the cascade and cascading style sheets, that's what it means, that the fact that these things all can apply at once. So as an example, right, I can have a rule that applies to paragraphs using our paragraph selector, right? This applies to all paragraphs. So given them a font panel with Helvetica, I could write a rule that applies to elements with the class alert. Notice the dot. Learning and getting used to CSS requires you to be able, you'll practice being able to sort of notice when people use that dot. And that will like start jumping out at you and being sort of reading is very different, almost like it's reading like a foreign language, a different kind of thing. So again, this is going to apply to all elements that have class of alert. They may have other classes as well, but they have the alert class. Similarly, I can have a rule that applies to elements with the class success. Again, there's my dot, and that's the name of the class success. And it applies to all elements with a class of success. And then, of course, our rules indicate what those stylings are, right? All paragraphs are Helvetica, alerts are bigger, and successful things are colorful. They're green. If I then write a paragraph that has both those classes, it has the alert class and it has the success class, then this paragraph is going to be in Helvetica font because the paragraph rule said be Helvetica. It's going to be a larger font size because the alert class said be a larger font size. And it's going to be green in color because the rule applying to success classes said be a green color. I'm going to mess the language up of this because we often sort of compress this. But when we say this styles alert elements, or rather when we say the alert class gives it this styling, that's not really what the class itself doesn't do anything, right? Paragraph having class alert is just really having like a label. It's like putting a name tag on it, right? You're just noting, saying, hey, that class, it's an alert. And that means nothing in itself, right? The class is just an alert. All right, fine, right? The class is success, fine. The class is a doodad, doesn't matter. It's just a label we're adding to it. What makes that label then be meaningful, right? Actually do something is the selector, is the fact that we have a selector that says the rule that says that any element who happens to have alert, and hey, this guy happens to have the alert, that thing will get larger. So it's not that the class alert makes the paragraph larger, it's that the paragraph has the class of alert, and our rule makes anything with a class alert larger. So like transitively, the paragraph becomes larger, but be clear that it's not the class name that's doing that work. It's the rule we've written that's doing the work of actually styling something. The class names are just how we associate those two things together. And these things have to match exactly, right? They have to match in terms of capitalization, in terms of styling, right? You can't have this can't be alerts, and this would be alert singular. Those won't work together. They have to, again, be matching sort of character for character. All right, cool. The thing that then comes up when we're dealing with the cascade, occasionally, not a lot, but it's a thing that you'll need to sort of keep an eye out for, is that it's possible that we might have two rules that conflict. And they specify different values for the same property. So we're seeing my cascade happening already here, right? Where I have list items that have been made Helvetica, And elements that are out of place are given a background color of green yellow. So my last list item here is both Helvetica, right? Notice it's a sans serif font, and it's style green, right? Both of those things are applying to it. If I wanted to add a different rule, or if I said I actually want all my list items to have a background color of light gray, for example, right, we're gonna give them a gray color. The question then is which rule applies, right? I've now said one thing says, hey, list items should be gray, but something else says that out of place element should be green yellow. If this element here is both a list item and it's out of place, well, which one is it? Is it light gray or is it green yellow? So the way that this gets handled in CSS and handled by the browsers is that if two properties conflict, the more specific rule wins. So whatever value the more specific rule says to use, that's what ends up happening. That's what takes over. The idea is that if you're thinking about rules as like instructions, that general rules are sort of applied first, they're applied generally, and then the more specific details are used to sort of replace that. The example I've used is if you imagine like you're telling someone to paint your house, you might say, paint this room gray, but paint that wall yellow. Right? You wouldn't say paint that wall yellow, but paint the room gray. Like that, again, that would sort of be like, well, the more specific thing, the single wall, that's what we're more interested in styling. That more specific rule ends up taking effect. That's how we tend to communicate with people. You may not have thought about it, but it's true. And that's how we'll then communicate with the browser. So more specific rules win. Class selectors are always considered more specific than tag selectors. And so by specific, it means how sort of limited that set of options is going to be. It doesn't mean specific like there are fewer elements it applies to, right? I'm not saying that this out of place element is more specific because there's only one thing there and the list item there's 4 things, right? It doesn't matter how many things actually show up in the HTML. What we're saying is that paragraph tag selectors are more generic, right? They're going to sort of apply to sort of a broader category of things versus class selectors that are more specific. They'll apply to sort of a less broad category of things. They're going to apply to a more specific class of things. So class selectors are more specific than tag selectors. And there's some more details. We'll go into specificities later, but we'll talk about that in like the next video. Okay. Right? So again, my class is more specific, so my green yellow is more specific, which means that it will override my light gray element. Right, saved everything. Oh, all right, you're saved. If I replace it, you'll notice that all my list items are gray, except for this one that is green yellow, because even though we said all list items should be gray, this more specific rule wins. If we open up the developer tools, where we talked about developer tools and sort of, I think the very first video we talked about our tooling here, we can actually be able to then look at individual elements in order to then be able to see what rules are applying. So if we look at this this LI element that's out of place, we can see that it has 2 rules applying to it. It has the out of place rule that's applying to it, that's giving a background color of yellow, and it has the LI rule applying to it, which is giving a font color of Helvetica and a background color of light gray. The background color of light gray here has been crossed out because this other rule is what's called overriding it, right? It's winning out. It says, oh no, we said to make it gray, and we sort of, you can imagine almost like it did make it gray, but then decided to paint over it by making it green yellow instead. So so the more specific rule will win. If 2 rules have the same specificity, right, they're equally specific. So we have, for example, 2 class selectors. You do, for example, that. So this could be this element is both the out of place and is also the last item in our list. Right? I'm going to add a second class. So again, there's our space. So we've got class 1, class 2. If we then try to add another rule, like this is the last item, that says the background color for our last item should be, how about let's use is there a purple? How about we'll use the light pink. So these 2 rules are equally specific, right? They're both class selectors. So the question then is which one wins? And the answer is the last one on the page wins. So you can think of this almost in order. Like we said, hey, You two are equally specific, but we told you to paint first. You said paint the wall green. You are equally specific, so we say you paint the wall pink. And because we said paint the wall pink after we said paint the wall green, the pink is the paint that we ended up with in the end. If you change the order of these in your CSS file, right? So that now I'm saying first style it, right? The first thing on the page is say style the last item. Then I'm saying style the ones that are out of place. Then my element turns green because now because then given these equally specific rules, this one is now the last one, so that one wins. And again, they're both beating out the background color from the gray background from the LI because both of them are more specific than LIs. Okay. This is a thing that's worth keeping in mind a little bit as you're writing your CSS, but you don't really need to focus or worry about too much. We actually spend a lot of time talking about specificity because it's kind of complicated, but it also doesn't actually impact what you do a lot. In the end, writing your CSS rules ends up feeling pretty natural, right? Like you're going to say like, great, I'm going to style my selectors and then I'll style my classes. And like the classes are going to beat the selectors because again, you are thinking about giving instructions, and the way we think about instructions are start general and then go specific. That's how people tend to list and how people tend to communicate in English anyway. So these things end up sort of working out that way anyway. So don't stress or worry about sort of the specificity, how specific rules are too much, but it's a good thing to keep in mind that if you like thought that you had a rule that said all paragraphs should be one color, and it turns out some paragraph isn't that color, it could be because you have another rule somewhere else that's like a class-based rule that's telling it to be slightly different. So it's a good thing to keep in mind as you begin troubleshooting or debugging your kinds of code where things might start falling apart. Okay. The last thing that I want to sort of talk about in this video, and this is going to take a little bit, are what are called how we pick these names, right? Like you'll notice I've done some examples where I made something called last item, out of place. We've had some examples with alerts, success. There's sort of, we pick these words at random, effectively. We sort of pick them out of a hat, as it were. The general line is that naming things, coming up with names for this is actually one of the two hardest things you have to do in any kind of computer programming or any kind of computer science as a discipline. Catchment validation being the other one, because catchment validation is just like a nasty thing. We don't care about, it's not relevant to us, but naming things is really, really, really hard. Because it's hard to sort of come up with like, how do you want to label and name and categorize these things on the fly in ways that are meaningful and make sense. So when we're coming up with names for classes, when we're trying to think about names for anything really in programming or anywhere, there are two main goals that we have in mind. These are sort of our stylistic goals. The first is that we want to make sure that our class names are understandable, that they help explain what kind of style is being applied. I should be able to look at this HTML and kind of make sense of why we've named these classes, like what they mean and what they represent, right? This is a class that says this is out of place because it is. This is a class that says it's the last item because it is. We want to name classes in such a way that they actually are meaningful, right? They actually explain what's going on so that a person, a human being reading your code is able to make sense of that and able to gain more understanding of what's going on. This is why we don't name classes like class 1, right? That doesn't tell us anything about what's going on. So that's not considered a good class name. We definitely don't want to name the class A and B and C, right? Say this has 3 classes because those don't mean anything, right? I can't say it has class A. I can't understand that. It's very confusing. It doesn't tell me anything about any information. So we really want to make sure we're naming our classes in such a way that they are understandable, right? They help communicate more details and more information just in the names themselves to the human beings who may be reading and understanding your code. The other sort of goal to keep in mind when we're coming up with CSS classes and sort of how we were sort of designing classes at all is we want to make them so they are modifiable. So web development and web programming, web code is an example as a form of software. Great, software, right? The reason it's called software is because it's soft, it's malleable, it changes over time, as opposed to hardware, which once it's built, you can't modify it, right? It's like it exists. So our goal in writing any kind of code is we want to be able to make sure it's very easy, as easy as possible to be able to change our styling later, right? I want to be able to make sure that I can adjust how I've named and how I've used these classes so that if I decide I want to make my page look different, I can do that with sort of a minimal amount of work. I don't have to go rewrite a lot of work if I want to just tweak, make something small change to my page. We want to make sure that if I make some small change to my page, I don't, to one part of my page, and I try to change like the header, I don't accidentally change a whole bunch of other stuff at the same time, which is probably why we use classes to help organize and break these things apart. So I'm not styling all paragraphs at once. So whenever we talk about good style, like how to write good code, those are our two goals, right? Our goals are understandability. How do I be able to understandability, meaning a human can read it and interpret what's going on without having to think too hard. I'm assuming they know the language. And then modifiability, how can we change it in the future? So when it comes to CSS, sort of designing your CSS classes and coming up with names for these things and sort of how we want to use classes, there's two general approaches we can use that sort of achieve this goal of understandability and these goals of modifiability. The first one, which is the one that I've been using as examples for most of these examples so far, is to use what are called CSS class naming. So the idea is that we're going to name the classes based on the semantic meaning, right? The actual purpose of that HTML element. So this is the example that we've used so far, right? This element is out of place. That's explaining what it is. It is the last item. That's explaining what it is, right? They're adding more semantic meanings. It's almost like these are elements, tags that I wish existed, but they're not part of HTML. You could we might have a div that could be a forum post, tells us what it is. We could have a nav that is a sidebar nav. We can have an image what that image is. That's the avatar's icon, right? Your little profile icon. We can have an article that is a breaking news article and so on, right? We can use classes to then say I want ways of customizing how I want to style that thing. Right? I want to style this article distinct from other articles because this is a breaking news style article, right? This image is going to be different from other images because it is an avatar icon style image. If we then want to use more details, we can use what's called a sentence selector, which we'll talk about in a later video, which lets us be able to talk about elements that are inside of these sort of more grouping elements. So we can get to sort of more detail as we go. But we'll come back to this kind of idea more in a later video. So this works great, right? You basically come up with saying, okay, what is this thing, right? This class is an out of place class. This paragraph is this is my title heading one. This paragraph is my introduction paragraph. And you can basically use that to say, here's how I want to name the class that I want to work with. The other approach that we can use is to use what are called modular class names. So in this case, we're going to name our classes and we're going to come up with our classes, like what classes we want to use for our CSS based on what is the single style that they happen to apply. Usually a single style, maybe one or two. So in this case, what we can, and this is a little bit like that example I did earlier where I had a thing that was going to be green. Right? The class green doesn't explain the meaning or purpose of an element. It says literally what it looks like. And we can write classes that do that, right? I could design a class that is font large. And I could have a rule that says that any class that is font large, that is on a large font, give it a large font and give it some extra line space between it. Any element that has the class text red could be made to be red. And that's the whole rule, right? Our text red rule would be a little bit like green, right? Text red might simply say that our color is going to be red. And that's the whole rule, right? It just says applies that one element, that one property. We might say that any element that has a background secondary gets a particular secondary background. And then we can use some other combining ways to be able to sort of provide further detail on this. Right? I can say that I have an image, and instead of indicating that my image is an avatar icon, which tells us why it's getting styled in that way, I can say that my image is going to be small and rounded with a shadow. So it doesn't tell us why it looks that way, but it tells us what it does look like. So when I read my semantic class name, right, this says this is an avatar icon. So I know why it's styled that way. But I don't know, just from reading my HTML, I don't know what an avatar icon looks like, right? Are they circles? Are they squares? Are they big? Are they small? Do they have shadows? Do they not? Like, what do they look like? Versus this, I now know exactly what this image looks like. It is a small, rounded image with a drop shadow, but I don't know why. I don't know what's going on here, right? Is it because it's an avatar? Is it because I just think circled images are cool? It doesn't tell us what's happening there. So either of these approaches really ends up working, right? They both are ways of being understandable, right? Because this is telling me what it looks like. This is telling me what it means. They're both modifiable in different ways. So if I want to go modify the avatar icon, well, I just go to my class, my single rule that says change the avatar icon, I just change it, and now my avatar icons look different. If I go here, if I want to change my image looks like, I actually will modify the HTML instead to say add or remove classes. If I decide my avatar icons should be squares instead of rounded, I would just delete the rounded class from this image, it could stay inside my CSS file because other things might be rounded. Remember, because again, these rules can apply to multiple elements, but I can then be able to customize what it looks like here as opposed to having to customize what it looks like inside the CSS itself. So in terms of modifiability, it's a little bit about where you're modifying things. In terms of understandability, it's a little bit about what you're trying to understand the appearance using these classes, or you're trying to understand the semantics using these classes. And either approach works. So the thing with web programming, and we'll cover this, I think we've mentioned this before, is there's lots of ways of achieving any kind of styling and any kind of goal in doing web programming. There's almost always 4 different answers that get you to the same place. And one of these is going to be like, how do we want to name our classes? And the real answer is it doesn't matter. What you want to do is you want to pick what works well for you, what makes sense, right? For you and for anyone else who's going to be interacting with this program or with this code. So if it makes sense for you to use more semantic names like forum post or avatar icon, then do that, write your CSS that works that way. If it makes more sense for you to have a CSS class that was green or rounded or small, use that. That works okay. In general, you want to try not to mix and match them too much, just because it might get confusing to you if you've got like, well, if I want to change this thing, if I need to go change the avatar icon part, or do I need to change that small part of it? Like that can get a little bit confusing. So it's often useful to be consistent in how you're selling these things, but it really doesn't matter. You can pick what works well for you. And you'll notice this happens a lot with web programming, where really what you want to do and how you want to do something is up to you. And in this class, we're going to try to be providing the sort of the technical material, right? The syntax, the ways that you can go about doing things, but then really it becomes up to you. It is your decision, your authority to figure out how you want to approach these things in order to put them together. We'll try to indicate best practices, like that you should make things nameable, usable, understandable, and modifiable, right? Those are the goals. We'll indicate sort of different approaches, but then often which approach you use is up to you. Okay. But yeah, so again, and these are guys I'm showing this as both an example of the kinds of class names that you might see, right? These are ways of thinking of these. And again, none of these are like built into the web browser, right? All of these, every single one of these class names has to have a CSS rule that applies to it in order to make it have any actual stylistic impact. And again, so now we're thinking about like why or how am I naming classes? These are some examples of way to think through that. The last thing I'll do, and if you're already overwhelmed, you can just tune out the video from this point, is one particular example that I find interesting. It's not particularly friendly, but I find it really interesting for thinking about styling. Is a particular naming schema, a particular way of naming CSS classes, what's called the BEM style, also known as the block element modifier styling. So this is used by like big tech companies like IBM and Microsoft, like big old tech companies. You don't see it a lot in web. You probably won't see it in the library world anywhere, but you might, because if you're using a tool or a framework or a platform developed by some other large tech company, like if you use like the way Canvas is provided by Instructure, for example, you might see these kinds of things showing up. So it may be worth keeping an eye out for this. But this naming schema basically names all of its classes using 3 parts. So it would name a single class, and this is a single class name, right? Even though it's got a bunch of dashes in it, because the dashes don't mean anything. That you name it using what's called a block. Then you put 2 underscores, use underlines, right? We'll use what's called the element, and then 2 dashes, and then you provide a modifier. And that's how we come up with names for these classes. The block is going to be the part of the web page we're on. For example, the nav bar, the sidebar, the forum post, etc. These are sort of a very semantic, like high-level understanding of what part of the page are we dealing with. The element is then going to represent what part of that page are we talking about, right? This could be a tab inside of a nav bar. Maybe it's the text inside of a forum post, right? Maybe it's the avatar inside of the forum post, right? We're going to be talking about those kinds of pieces. And then the modifier is used to then provide any kind of differentiator. So for example, this could be the selected tag. This might be the latest forum post or the last forum post. This could be the forum post's avatar icons, but it could be a deleted user icon, which has its own special styling, right? There could be some other piece to go along with this. So again, what this ends up looking like in practice, right, is we're gonna start writing out components, right? We're gonna start writing out HTML that names things in this way. So I might have a div that's gonna be my block, that's my nav bar. So this whole area is my nav bar. And then I have one div that represents a tab inside that nav bar. So here's my nav bar with a tab. And so it's the class is named nav bar tab. And then I have a second tab after it, which is going to be the selected tab. So that gets the navbar tab selected. Similarly, and this is an example from, I think, one of these links, actually how this works, is you can imagine that I might have a form. This form is one thing users input. We're not going to talk about forms too much in this class. But I might have a form that's going to be a form element, and then it's going to have a form that has the modifier, right? Modifiers come after the the 2 dashes of theme, of a Christmas themed. And then it could also have the simple form styling as well. So it's both a simple Christmas themed form. This input then lets you sort of say that the input is an input type inside the form. And then this input is going to be a submit type input that happens to have the disabled modifier. So what the reason this is used is because this lets us be able to style things individually without having to worry about like getting our names mixed up, without having to worry about specificity rules, arguing too much because everything's kind of working together. And it basically provides this very sort of like highly prescriptive naming schema that can be used for doing this kind of CSS. I find it interesting, and I think it's worth thinking about when you're talking about doing page design, thinking about sort of parts of the page, elements in that page, and then stylings, differentiators in that page. I find that to be a really useful thing when thinking about design, right? What does your page look like? But this actual like syntax for like how you want to name these things, this is not enforced by a browser. It requires human level dedication to doing this, right? You have to make sure you're naming everything very precisely, and then the only one who controls that is you, and the people you work with. I do not recommend you do any of this in your real life if you can avoid it. It's awkward, and it's probably not relevant for any kind of library projects you're working on. But again, it's a way of thinking about potentially different and unique and odd ways of naming and styling and coming up with how we want to name classes to make these things come together. Okay, and that's the basic idea. So again, the sort of the real takeaway, the things that are really important here, is this idea of the class selector at all, right? The fact that I can give HTML elements a class attribute that gives that lets us put in a tagged name of some kind that says what kind of thing that is. And then I can write a rule that applies to using a dot to make it a class selector that selects elements that happen to have that class, so that I can now style individual elements on their own, distinct from all the other elements of that particular type. So I don't have to style, I can style single list items or single paragraphs or single divs, distinct from all the other list items or paragraphs or divs on the page.